Hey, my name is Chile DeCastro. I'm a constitutional law researcher and a bit of a legal fanatic. I'm going to explain today a little bit of the case the Supreme Court decided called Sanchez versus Mayorkas. That happened June 7th, 2021. Now, a lot of people may think that this was a blow to undocumented immigrants. What it was the Supreme Court followed what's called statutory construction. And what that means Congress writes laws. The president signs those laws into effect. The Supreme Court then judges by opinion and voting on opinion whether or not that law is constitutional or not. In Sanchez versus Mayorkas, what the Supreme Court said is that we are not going to change the legislation listed by Congress. And that's exactly what we want. Whether you're pro-immigration or against immigration isn't really the relevant thing today. What is relevant is that the Supreme Court did not create laws from the bench. And that's the most important part. That really is the most important part, because when the Supreme Court creates laws from the bench, it's absolute tyranny. Both the left and the right is extraordinarily unhappy because of all the laws created by the Supreme Court. What they did today was they said, we are not going to go in and edit legislation. We are not going to create meaning around words so that it can work in the favor of the undocumented immigrant, Jose Sanchez, or work in the favor of the state, Mayorkas. This is a good thing. I have a lot of friends here in the United States who are undocumented immigrants here in California, in Florida, in New York. I know undocumented immigrants who live in these places. I want to be clear to them. This was not a ruling against you, even though it may slightly affect some people. Well, it can dramatically affect some people. In the meantime, what this was the judiciary saying that we have a specific role, and that role is to determine whether or not a law is constitutional or unconstitutional. And for the past, since the inception of the Supreme Court, what they have done is they have created legislation from the bench. Terry versus Ohio. There was no legislation on Terry. Nobody wrote up, here's the Terry laws. That didn't happen. That was actually created by an appeals court named Justice Bernard Friedman at a Cuyahoga County appeals court. That is what has created the most tyrannical police state in the world, because we are now spreading our tyrannical police state into the Native American sovereign lands and putting Terry v. Ohio into their communities. I want to stay as focused as I can on Sanchez versus Mayorkas, and I'm going to repeat myself a couple of times because I want to be clear and I want you guys to understand what I've learned. I'm no smarter than you are, and you're probably smarter than me. So that means that you're going to be able to pick up the things that I'm saying. This is not complicated, difficult. It's just not hard. You should be able to pick all this up. Sanchez versus Mayorkas, what happened was in 1997, Jose came here with his wife and they said, hey, we're from El Salvador and we have to leave there because we are under threat of death. So they entered America illegally, and they were then given what's called TPS, temporary protection status. However, because they had come into America illegally, not through the process that we have set up, then they were here illegally, even though the government had granted them temporary protection status. So lawyers out there, what we need to start to take a look at is when the government grants undocumented immigrants temporary protection status, then we need to look at that as them granting legal status, even temporary legal status, to an undocumented worker. And the reason why is And the reason why is it's like plain as the nose on your face. If we say that someone is here and they're here, we give them temporary protection status, but in the computer they're listed as illegal, then that means that we have an agency here called ICE that can go in and take that person and ship them back to a country that they've never been to. The children who were born here have never been to El Salvador, but they can be shipped back. Does that even make any sense? But it does, it's true. They can be shipped to El Salvador even though they were born here and have never lived in El Salvador. So Jose and his wife came here in 1997. This is 2021. So you're looking at 24, maybe 25 years that they've been here. Have they had any children? I don't know these answers. I just know the fundamentals of this case. This is good for you and me. Not the idea that we're ruling against undocumented immigrants, but it's good for you in the idea and the ideology and the philosophy and the constitutional merit that these judges who are really specifically all of them, not just the liberals or conservatives, they're all tyrants. They don't work for you and me. They work against our civil liberties continuously from the beginning of time. Since Marbury versus Madison, these people that some call justices, I don't, I call them tyrants. From Ruth to Anthony to the only one that was good was John Harlan. And William O. Douglas was pretty good, but he was also a product of his environment. And on a lot of O. Douglas's rulings, he rules in the wrong way. I'm gonna stay focused on just Sanchez versus Mayorkas. So you and I as Americans, we celebrate this ruling today because what this does is it shows that these Supreme Court justices are respecting the separation of powers. Even though Jose Sanchez's case is very compelling, it's emotional and it's real, and Jose came here and he was going to be killed in El Salvador, and it's a success story. He came here and he's lived an exemplary life. He doesn't break the laws. He contributes to society. He pays his taxes. But because the TPS, the temporary protection status, says illegal on it, he cannot get an American green card or even apply for citizenship because the TPS in the beginning. That's where you and I need to focus our energies as people who are lawyers and legal experts. If we change the TPS, so let's just make an example out of it. Say that your cousin comes over here from Guatemala and he comes into the United States and he says, look, in Guatemala, they're gonna kill me. And so I have to get out of Guatemala, which is a legitimate thing. In other countries, if people don't like you, they can just kill you and there is no ROL, rule of law. Everybody loves rule of law to a point. When rule of law becomes authoritarian and tyrannical, then we all start to go, what the hell is this and who the hell are these guys enforcing these things on me when I'm a free human being? And that's the problem with the police state. What this does to undocumented workers, undocumented immigrants who have come here, is it makes them targets. This is the sad part of it. It makes them targets. James Madison right there. I don't know if you can see his head, he's right there. James Madison is, along with Thomas Jefferson, the main authors of the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. And James Madison was extraordinarily clear in his thinking and how things were supposed to be set up with our Constitution. We're supposed to have checks and balances. Now, while conservatives and liberals and Democrats and Republicans can hash it out in the public, when it comes to the Supreme Court, conservative and liberal don't mean the same thing. If you're a conservative in real life, you're probably not a conservative Supreme Court justice kind of guy. If you are a liberal in real life, you are certainly not a liberal kind of Supreme Court justice. The only way that these two things stay in alignment is regarding the Second Amendment. Throughout the history of time, liberal justices have tried to strip our Second Amendment right, which is a civil liberty, not a civil right. A civil right is when Congress writes legislation to protect a minority class's civil liberties. Civil liberties are what you're born with. You have a right to these liberties from God, from the universe, from the Creator, before man ever wrote a charter. Before there was ever a Constitution or a Bill of Rights, you had inalienable civil liberties that existed. I don't need the Second Amendment to tell the government that I have a right to bear arms. I tell the government I have a right to bear arms because I'm a human being. and I have natural law that allows me to protect myself. So I just wanted to be clear with the undocumented workers who are my friends that I'll do a caveat on it, a very light caveat here, and then I've got to get back to work. As long as we continue to lock out undocumented workers and also dreamers who've come here with their parents and never had a choice to move here, as long as we continue to lock them out of a piece of the American dream, they will continue to send their money back to El Salvador, back to Mexico, back to Guatemala, because they don't have anywhere to put their money. And I'm not sure if you've noticed or not, but when you drive around the tent cities all around the country, from New York to Florida to Alaska to Minnesota to California to Oregon, when you drive around, there's not very many Latinos living in tent cities. The Latinos who come over from South America are workers, and they are working their butts off. And this is just a big thumbs up to the Latino workers who come here and just crush it, because they do jobs that most Americans don't want to do. So when you talk about Sanchez versus Mayorkas from 2021, this is actually a moment to celebrate that our Constitution and the way it was set up is working. While I detest all Supreme Court justices, I detest all of them. Throughout my studies, I thought that there would be some there have been some conservative justices like William Rehnquist, stayed extraordinarily consistent when it came to constitutional values. Extraordinarily consistent. Anthony Scalia is the opposite. Anthony Scalia is a total hypocrite and a total fraud. Now, I know that because I read his cases, I read his words, I read what he did. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is another one. Put her picture up, celebrate Ruth because she's a woman. She ruined our country. She wrote the decision in Arizona versus Johnson of 2009. However, today, in Sanchez versus Mayorkas, today is a day that I celebrate. I celebrate that these people, these guys, Brett, Clarence, Elena, they actually upheld the idea that their job is not to edit legislation written by Congress, and it is not to pass laws like the president does. Their job is to determine the constitutionality of the written legislation and the law signed into effect by the president. That's very important that we understand the difference here, because the reason why our country is ruined, and the reason why both the hard left, the hard right, the center, the middle left, the middle right, the reason why everybody is unhappy is because we have a bunch of laws created that we never voted for, created by a bunch of guys that we never elected. And that's the problem in America today. The most destructive law is Terry versus Ohio. It was created by the judiciary. We never voted that cops could walk up to us and make us get on our knees because we're suspicious. We never voted for that. That never happened. I never voted for that. Did you ever vote for that? Our parents never voted for that. They just decided that because of racism in the 60s. Listen, I got nothing but love for you. Celebrate what happened today, even though it is gonna hurt some people. It is gonna hurt some people for sure. What this does essentially though, is it kicks the ball back to Congress and says, hey, you have 2.5 million to 12.5 million undocumented immigrants in America. We are not going to be your fallback. Congress is gonna have to get together and pass legislation about immigration reform. We are in a republic. We are a Republican country based on that we vote for a representative who then represents us, Republican. That's what that means. Republican does not mean a political party. Republican means that we vote for representatives who then do our bidding. So the Supreme Court today kicked this case back to Congress and said, if you guys want to do something about Jose Sanchez, write some legislation. 9-0, meaning that they are not going to use judicial activism, which is exactly what I'm railing about all the time, is judicial activism. When the Supreme Court creates laws from the bench, and you and I don't get to decide on that. We don't get to vote out that person. Well, after Terry, 9 out of 10 stops are Terry stops. And Terry turns into Wren, which also turns into Cortez. All the cases just give the police more rights over you. After we overturn Terry, then 9 out of 10 interactions with police come to an end. because you can't just walk up to me and say, I want to see some ID. And why they do that in 1968? Because blacks were freed in 54, and then 15 years later, they said, hey, you know, we want some freedom here. So by 68, they passed Terry versus Ohio to remove those freedoms from 1954. And from 1964, the Civil Rights Act, and from 65, the Voting Rights Act, and the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which is meaningless with Terry v. Ohio. It's completely meaningless. Your rights are completely meaningless. If a cop can walk up to you and say, because I'm suspicious, I'm just another man, I'm just another person, I got a hunk of metal on my chest and a gun on my side, I'm here to help. You clown, right? Imbecile. Guy can walk up to you and say, I'm suspicious of you. Get on your knees. There's a problem. We have a major problem. At least today, the judiciary took steps to remain and stay within the American values of our Constitution. All right, I'll see you guys Juneteenth. Later.